In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we are in the attributes of God subhanahu wa ta'ala. Until now we have finished the attributes of essence, and we have just started into the attributes of action. So this lesson is a little bit shorter in the book in that it only has an introduction, and then the introduction is a little bit longer than normal introductions, and then the author goes into the three main attributes of action that he wants to present in this lesson, and then there is a number of other attributes of action that he will be presenting in the next lesson. In the meantime, I always remind you that there are general principles and rules that once you understand them, then you can apply them to the rest. So as you hear the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, keep in mind what we have said until now and that we'll keep saying. So the general distinction that we've made until now between the attributes of essence and the attributes of action. Maybe a quick reminder. So the author doesn't really give a lot of a reminder, but for us, for the continuity of the course, we said that we can look at a thing on its own, by itself, and we could look at a thing as it has a relationship with other entities. This is an important point because in the case of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it may be confusing in some instances to say these are attributes of action. So we start thinking only about action, but it may get confusing. That's why we said, to make things simpler and clearer, we say either we look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the necessary being by himself, and when we do that, we're looking at what we call the attributes of essence. Or we look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as having a relationship with another entity. That relationship is what we refer to as the attributes of action. So we don't really look at the action of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and today inshallah this point will become a lot clearer. Why do we say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, why do we say that in the case of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala it's not necessarily that we're looking at the action itself? No, we want to look more at the relationship between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and another entity. The moment we do that, we're looking not only at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we're looking at something else, we are right away in the attributes of action. Okay, so that's the general reminder. An important point to keep in mind. The moment we said that we're looking at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from another entity and the relationship between Allah and another entity, right away we've opened the door to an infinite amount of angles, of perspectives through which we can look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? So depending on what we want to look at, from which angle we want to look at it, because we're not only looking at Allah as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're looking at Allah as having a relationship from a specific perspective, from a specific angle. So that opens the door to an infinity of ways to look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, potentially. That's why the author says we can categorize these angles, these perspectives of looking at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in two big categories. The first one are the actions of Allah, or the relationship between Allah and another entity that is direct. So obviously, the other way is going to be the indirect way, or what I refer to here as a mediated way. There's an intermediary. So in what sense do we mean that? If I say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the world, as an example, there's nothing else. There's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and there's a creation of the world. I don't need to imagine anything else for that relationship to make logical sense to me. So the relationship, this is a direct action. You don't need anything else for this relationship to make sense. There's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and there's the world and there's a relationship of creation. if I say, for instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala al-Raziq, or the sustainer, now it gets a little bit more complicated. I need a recipient of that sustainment. The provision that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to be received by another entity. So I have to imagine another entity. And depending on what kind of rizq, of kind of sustenance I'm talking about, I have to imagine a relationship between that entity and the sustenance. Is it food? Is it money? Is it water? Is it air? That adds more to the complexity of the relationship. So the relationship may become mediated, and there's an intermediary. You have to imagine other entities in the equation for that to make full sense. So there are some of these relationships that are direct, and others that are going to be complex or indirect or mediated. Okay, so the author splits them into these two big categories. So he says either they are direct, for instance, creation, or indirect, he uses sustenance. Another one, for instance, forgiveness. That one becomes even more complicated. If we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala al-Ghafar or al-Ghafur, the one who forgives, or the forgiver, that relationship, for it to make sense, means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not only a necessary being, and we stop there. It means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what we will explain to do. He has a lordship. We're going to explain that today. He has a lordship that we call legislative. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not only a lord in the existential sense, He's also a lord in the sense that He prescribes commandments and laws that have to be obeyed. Which means on the other side, there's an entity that is a servant in the relationship of servitude with Allah, who may or may not be able to obey, choose to obey or not obey those commandments. And when they choose not to obey those commandments, they go into a state where they ask for Allah's forgiveness, and so Allah may forgive them. So the relationship, even though it may look very simple, for that attribute of action, which is forgiver, it becomes a lot more complex. For that one to make sense, I have to go through a series of intermediaries, a series of, in reality, other actions or other attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that may be action or may be of essence, for that one to make sense. Okay, so in that sense, it's further away from the divine essence, right? There's a lot more intermediaries. So this ties into what we said before, that we can derive some attributes from others, that some of them are at a higher level, and so they are more important, and everything can be derived out of them. So this is another way to look at it. That's why he's saying there are attributes of action that are direct, and others that are further away. There's intermediaries. For that relationship to make sense, other pieces of the puzzle have to be added into the equation. Okay, so this is general remarks. Still in the introduction, and this one is a reminder, we said that generally speaking, we can tell if an attribute has to do with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by Himself as an entity, or it has to do with the relationship between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and another being. Okay? But we added that there are times when we look at an attribute that is a relationship. First of all, just as a quicker reminder, and then I'll mention the point. We said that all the attributes of action are derivable from the attributes of essence. And that's why the attributes of essence are at a higher level of abstraction. We said when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has life, it means He has power or will, and He has knowledge and consciousness. If we understand those attributes, we can go a level lower and start deriving other attributes out of the attribute of power or the attribute of knowledge. For instance, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all hearing or all seeing. Okay, that comes out of either knowledge, or you say the ability to, which may fall under power again. So we said all the attributes of action, which we're going to explore some of them today, They're derivable from the attributes of essence. That was one point. The second point is that we can look at certain attributes from more than one angle. So if I want to look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as having created the world, so there's a relationship between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and another entity, in this case the world, then I am very clearly in an attribute of action. But if I say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the ability to create whatever He wishes, this is not an attribute of action. This is a derivation from the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is an attribute of essence. Allah is powerful whether He creates or doesn't create. Allah is powerful whether He exercises that power or doesn't. Allah is knowledgeable whether He exercises that knowledge or He doesn't. By essence, He is knowledge or knowledgeable. By essence, He is power or powerful. Okay? So these are reminders. We covered those, but just so that it makes sense for the future. The divine action, so this point he explains later in the lesson, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow here. The divine action, because we said we are in the attributes of action, the divine action means there's a relationship with another entity. Sometimes, if we don't understand the attributes properly, it may seem to us that Allah's power, because we bring it back to the attribute of essence, or Allah's knowledge or another attribute, is limited. For instance, limited in time. For instance, limited in space. And we mistakenly start thinking that Allah's action is limited, Allah's power is limited, Allah's knowledge is limited, as though something can influence Him from the outside. The mistake happens because we forget that there's a relationship between two entities. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is on one side and the other entity is on the other. Depending on the recipient in that relationship, which is every other entity except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, depending on the circumstances of that recipient, the relationship is going to be limited. So if that recipient is limited in time and space, that relationship or the action is limited in time and space. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is my sustainer, of course I'm limited. I happened at a time. I didn't exist before and I will not exist after. It doesn't mean that Allah, the divine action, is limited. There is no limit to the divine action. There's a limit on the receiving end. Okay, so this may actually solve a lot of issues that some scholars and some schools of thought fall into when they limit the divine action in one way or another. Okay, so the divine action, by the way we defined it, is a relationship with another entity. There is no other entity that is absolute and infinite. Of course, because it is limited by whatever constraints, it means the divine action is always going to be limited based on the recipient, not based on the divine power or the divine knowledge or the divine side of the relationship. Okay, so that's the point.
Like an example of knowledge, Allah is all knowing and everything, and then we see the end, only receive some of that knowledge because He's not able to capture all of that knowledge, right?
100%. Even if an entity wanted to capture, is it possible to capture the divine knowledge, even if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to? It's impossible. Okay. So here, the author doesn't mention these verses. He just says in passing that there are some verses in the Quran that may fall into this category. So this is the one that we just talked about. Some attributes may be both. When we said some attributes, they may seem as though they are attributes of essence, for instance, but in reality they're attributes of action. Or they may seem that they're attributes of action, but they are attributes of essence. Why? Well, it depends. One, depending on where we're looking at it, and two, when it's happening. For example, if I say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the world, that's it, I'm in the action. Allah has the ability to create the world, we're in power. Power, essence. Right? Okay. Now let's go to knowledge. Why knowledge? Because the Holy Quran has a lot of verses. So he just says, as there are verses in the Quran. So I'm giving you a few of these verses that may be open to that kind of confusion. So a first verse, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So if a wound afflicts you, a wound like it has already afflicted those people, those other people. So this is in a situation where there's enmity, war between two sides. The Muslims feel that they are weaker, they're having a lot of difficulties. So the Quran is telling them, if a wound is afflicting you, a wound is also afflicting the other side. And we make such vicissitudes, or as the Quran says, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا. Okay, the fate, the destiny, we rotate it. One day you're rich, one day you're poor. One day it's easy, one day it's hard. And we make such vicissitudes rotate among humankind so that Allah may know those who have faith. So that Allah may know. Does God not already know?
He knows in a sense, but in application.
So this is a different kind of knowledge. So there's a knowledge by essence, which we talked about, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all-knowing in an absolute sense. But then we are in the action now where the knowledge happens after. And there's of course other ways to interpret it, but if we want to stick as literally as possible to the verse, it's basically a test. So that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to see you in action. Talk is cheap. Just to say, I have patience, I'm going to go through the difficulties, no problem. No, actually go through them and then your actions will speak. If you don't go through them, who knows what's going to happen once you go through them. Okay, so this is the real meaning of the verse. But if we want to stick to the knowledge part, so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that Allah may know. So this is a knowledge that comes after the action. After you have demonstrated or not, you have demonstrated your patience. A lot of verses in the Quran fall in this category. So someone may take it and say, see, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't know. This verse proves that Allah will only know after you do or don't do. He's waiting for you to see what you're going to do. Okay, at one level, yes. But this is not because He doesn't know what you're going to do. That was the divine knowledge by essence, the absolute one, and this is sometimes they call it the active knowledge. So al-ilm al-fi'li, it happens after the fi'l, or at the maqam al-fi'l. So it's happening at the domain in the world of action, not in the domain of the divine essence. Another verse. Now Allah has lightened your burden, knowing that there is weakness in you. So this is when the Muslims became a lot weaker. They were not able to defend themselves. The burden on them was lightened. The responsibility militarily was lightened. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not know that this was going to happen. It's like the hukum changes. The verdict is changing. Again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in an absolute sense, of course He knew. But this is the circumstances of life telling them, see, since this happened, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is now going to change the verdict for you. Now Allah has lightened your burden, knowing that there is weakness. عَلِمَ أَنَّ فِيكُمْ ضَعْفًا. It's as though it's in the past. Something happened and now God knows. But even though He knew from ever how you're going to react. Next verse. We will surely test you until we know those of you who struggle in the cause of Allah and those who are steadfast. Same situation. Does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not already know? He does. Another verse. And this is in Surah Al-Fath. Allah was certainly pleased with the faithful when they swore allegiance to you under the tree. This is in Surah Al-Hudaybiyah. He knew what was in their hearts, so He sent down tranquility on them. Did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not already know what was in their hearts? Was He waiting for them to pay allegiance to descend His tranquility and mercy and composure on them? Yeah.
So can we say that we need, technically we need this knowledge by action, because it will not make sense, right? Like for example, if Allah did something and told them, yo, because in the future you will do this, I'm doing this now. So it will not make sense, right?
Say that again.
So for example, if Allah Azza wa Jal sent al-azab for people, and they said, why? I said, because I know that in the future you'll do this. So it will be like a chaos in life. So can we link this to like the maybe wisdom behind why do we have the knowledge by action and knowledge by essence? Like why it's important to have like.
Yes, for us it helps. In practical terms, yes, and it links back to divine mercy and the system that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in place, that we always have the chance to rectify. And this is one of the interpretation of the Quran. There's a verse that says, وَلِلَّهِ الْحُجَّةُ الْبَالِغَةُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the final or the ultimate argument, because He's giving you all the chances. There is no excuse. He gave you all the chances to rectify, to fix, to redirect. So if you still don't at the end, then who is to blame but you? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never be in a position where without giving you the chance, He will punish. That goes against the whole point, right? Yeah.
And this also, Sayid, helps me understand. You mentioned that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being al-Ghafur, like the forgiving one. So if I say, oh Allah, forgive me, did I influence Allah? Therefore, did I make Allah change? But if you understand it in this term of action, no, my relationship with Allah changed. Therefore, that's why now I'm forgiven.
Yes, 100%.
See what I,
yes.
And that's what this is.
Yes.
So it's not,
It
Allah
really
never
helps.
changed or was influenced by my dua. It was a matter of my relationship changing with Him, which in turn, Allah also knew what would have happened if I stayed this way, if I stayed this way.
Exactly.
Whatever path I would have taken, it's all knowledge within His essence, but according to the path that I choose, becomes in His action.
Yes, exactly. And so you chose this path, and at some point you may decide, now I'm going to go in this path. This path leads there. It's a different place. This one leads here.
And in this, Allah's never changing. It's just that I'm changing. I'm jumping from here to here to here.
Exactly. He put those in place for you.
Yeah.
And He knows what you're going to do,
And He
but
knows.
that's in essence.
In essence.
Yes. Okay. So after this long general introduction, now we get into the attributes of action. Okay, so the first one is al-Khaliqiyya, which we translate as creatorship. General meaning. The general meaning of this attribute, we bring it back to what we explained when we presented the proof of the necessary being. There, we said that the necessary being has a number of characteristics or attributes, which basically come down to the idea of the primal cause, or the creative cause, or the existential cause. Okay, we use different terms because those are the terms that are used in the books, but all of them mean the same thing. There is a relationship of absolute dependence between everything on another entity, which is the necessary being. It's a type of causality that we don't find anywhere else. That type of causality, we called it a primal causality, or existential or creative causality, and we spent a lot of time on that one. So if you still have all of that in mind, when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a creator, or He has creatorship, what we're referring to is that causality. So it's the cause of the existence of a being, as well as the existence of all of the attributes or perfections of that being. Okay? So that's all. We've covered it. Now we're adding one more word to refer to it, which is al-Khaliqiyya, which is the creatorship. Except that, here the author adds, so this was the link to everything we've said before. Now let's add another little layer. The layer is that in the terminology that we use and we find in the scriptures and the invocations and even in the books of theology, there are actually a number of other attributes that are used. So here we have to distinguish between a general sense of creatorship, which is the one we just explained, and a more restricted sense of creatorship. So if I mean Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates, so anything that exists has its ultimate source in the necessary being, that's the general sense of creatorship. That's one way al-Khaliq is used, al-Khaliqiyya is used. Another way it is often used is to say there are two types of creation. Okay, now I'm using the words loosely. Or causing things to be. Okay, let's put it in another way. There are two ways to cause things to be. Either you cause them to be from nothing or from something. And both have been used in the case of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's actions. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala causes some things to be out of nothing, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala transforms, manipulates things that exist into other things. Yeah.
Is that kind of like in Surah Yasin when it says at the end, فَإِذَا أَرَادَ شَيْئًا يَقُولُ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونُ?
Exactly. That's exactly what it is.
Okay.
And we'll come back in a second to that a little bit more. In the terminology, the technical terminology that we have, when you want to split both, often the terms that are used for the origination out of nothing is either mubdi' or mubda'. These are the ibda' is the creation out of nothing. It's an absolute origination. So there is no raw material from which you're working. There is nothing that is being manipulated into something else. There is nothing and then there is something. That's ibda'. And there are some terms in the Quran that may be referring to that type of creation. For instance, when the Quran uses the word fatar, it may be a reference to this type of creation. Fatr is basically rupture, okay, or a fissure, or a break. So they say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fatir al-samawat wal-ard, for instance. He rips open non-existence with the existence of heaven and earth. That's one way to understand creation. There's nothing and then there's something. Often this is referred to be more technically accurate as ibda' or mubdi'. Another way is there's something that already exists, but it may be morphed, transformed into something else. There is a strong opinion in between the commentators of the Quran that often when the Quran is using the word khalq, it's actually referring to that. It's as though every time the Quran wants to say something is created in stages, it uses the word khalq. It's not the kun fayakun. That's not khalq. The kun fayakun is al ibda'. There's nothing and then there's something. Al-Khalq is, for instance, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about He creates over 4 days or 6 days, which are phases or stages, 4 phases or 4 stages of creation.
Or us maybe.
Or the creation of human beings. And you see, khalaqa, when the Quran uses the word khalaqa in the womb, for instance, what happens to a human being? Khalqan, in one of the verses says, khalqan ba'da khalqan. A creation after a creation. So it's not that there's nothing and then there's something. It's that you're in a stage and you're moved to another stage. So there is something, but it's being transformed. This is another type of khalq. We often think of khalq as nothing into something, or in philosophy they say ex nihilo. There's nothing and then there's something. This is not the only type of khalq. This is an origination out of nothing, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does that. But if we open the door to that other type of creation, so there is something, but it changes into something else, that may actually help us in a lot of ways. First of all, we may understand the Quran completely differently. And then it may help us see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can create things in a way and get them to change. The seed that becomes a tree is a type of creation of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have created the tree in the first place, but He created it into a seed. Or an egg that becomes a chicken, or an embryo that becomes a human being. There's a point in all of this. This is to see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates you one stage after another, one phase after another. And so of course, we can link it to things like ancient Islamic philosophy. Okay, so in that one, they say there are 2 types of entities. I'm not saying this is, it's just between 2 brackets quickly. Islamic philosophy, old school Islamic philosophy. They say there are 2 types of entities. There are material and non-material beings. Everything that is material has been created from a primordial matter that was shaped into things. So this comes from Neoplatonism and Aristotelian philosophy, where they say Everything that exists has come from a pre-existing matter. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may have shaped it into this eventually. And this is why we see the world we see today. This is different than saying everything was created as is on its own. This is a transformation that's leading to everything we see today. And then there are things that are non-material. Those things were all created ex nihilo, out of nothing. And even that is questionable, but this is just to give you an idea of that ancient philosophy. Now let's link it to modern science. We could say the same thing. If someone is to say, I reject or accept, let's say, a theory like the Big Bang, assuming that it's valid scientifically, okay? There is no logical objection against it if you say, yeah, there's still a God behind it that caused it to be. No different than the seed that becomes a tree. This is a type of creation. It's not the creation ex nihilo, it's a creation that I create something and then I create in the sense of transform it from one stage to another. There's no issue with that. This could apply to the theory of evolution, this could apply so long as you don't fall into the parts of the theory that have nothing to do with science and they're ideological, such as saying, for instance, it's all randomness. All of it is there to invalidate the idea that this may have been the result of intentional design or intentional order, okay, which is the whole weakness of the theory. You remove that aspect and scientifically you could make it work, assuming that it's valid scientifically. So this type of khalq or creation opens the door to that. You have the creation ex nihilo out of nothing, or you have the creation that is through stages. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who guides through the stages, who transforms and creates from one stage to another. And that applies, if you read the Quran, go back and read the verses of the Quran that speak of khalq, you will see that there's always stages in khalq. It's never nothing and then something. And then you have other verses, such as the one you referred to in Surah Yasin, verse 82, that says, His will is simply that He says be, and it is. When He wants something, He says to it be, and it is. This is a different kind of creation. This is the ex nihilo. Okay. Main differences between the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because keep in mind what we said. We don't want to fall into the issue of not knowing what something is, ta'til, where a paralysis state where you don't understand what the word means, but you also don't want to do tashbih. Okay, so what does it mean? What's the difference? How do we make the attribute apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a way that we can still understand what it means? In our cases, we don't create anything ex nihilo, even in our head. In our mental world, we can't do that. We always manipulate things into other things. That's one. So that's why the word creation, if we mean by it ex nihilo, doesn't even apply. Okay, so we can say we construct, we fabricate, but it's not really a creation out of nothing. So that's one. Two, our creation is always by using organs and movement, which leads to, so keep that in mind, of course, that's the obvious one. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't use movement and organs and blueprints and plans and preconceived ideas and the whole planning process or the action process. But let's push that a little bit further. That's the obvious part. The non-obvious part is, the biggest difference is that when I create, my creation, my act of creating, and the result of my act are two different things. There's an action, there's a movement, there's thinking. The act of creation is different from the end result of what I create. Let's say I create a pen, or I create something I write, or a thought. The act of creation and the end result are two different things. In the case of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're one thing. There is no act and then the creation. The act is the creation. There's no organ, there's no movement, there's no planning, there's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's the other side of the relationship, and the relationship is our mental construct. The relationship, that's why we said in the previous lesson, the relationship is not a third thing. When I say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sustains a being, it's not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and sustenance and some other entity. The sustenance is the act. Right? I add a notion, I construct a notion to make it make sense to me mentally, which is the relationship. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's action is different than ours. Allah's action is no different than the end result of the action. It's actually one thing. But we're adding a layer to make it make sense to us, which is the relationship. So we call it creatorship, we call it lordship, divinity.
We did one particular view of the universally accepted among the Shia. This particular idea that we are presenting, is it of a certain
Yeah.
would you go to that?
No,
Not
everybody
for-
accepts that. Yeah.
Right?
Everybody
And
accepts
you see,
that. Yeah.
Because that sounds like unity existed.
No, so we're not saying the act is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Okay.
We're saying there's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and there's His action. But His action, the action of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is equal to the end result. Whatever, let's say it's creation.
So that means that created. Oh, okay.
So there is no Allah creation created.
Exactly.
So that means
Creation,
one-
let's say creation is khalq, the act of creating.
Yes.
Let's use creation as the act of creating. And creature is the end result.
So
There is no creation. Creation is my mental construct of the relationship between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the creature. So I call it creation or creatorship.
But in reality, not.
In reality, creatorship is the creature that has been created. It's not a third thing outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the act.
Not like okay. Not like there was like we said we been like there was not like an action performed for the end result. It's all in is it like instant or something like that?
So now we're not talking about that it's instant. We talked about that.
Okay.
Okay, now we're talking about there's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His act. But there's no third thing. It's only those two. Yes.
I don't know if this can be answered, if it's something that we're able to understand. I'm more of a visual person, and I kind of, when we speak about Khaliqiyya and like just creating out of nothing, I don't understand how out of zero matter, matter can be like just appear like that. I don't know if that can be answered by us or not.
Because we're stuck in the material world, we're stuck in a universe that we think works in a certain way, we're trying to impose those laws on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I think it helps if you say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the world, let's say, assuming that that law is correct in science, that nothing can be created out of nothing, nothing ever stops existing or starts existing out of nothing. Okay, assuming that that law is correct within the universe, it would mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created a system where these are the laws that apply in this system, and we're stuck in this system. Of course, we don't know what's going on outside of that system. That's the system we're stuck in. That's all we know. Just like you could, in your mind, create a world and you create some rules around that world, or as people sometimes do, you can create a virtual world, or some theoretical physicists actually do that, and they create universes. And they impose laws on those universes that are different than the ones we know. That's why you could create a parallel universe, or you can suppose that there's dark matter, or you can... Why? How can you do that? It's because you're creating another entity, another system, and you're applying different laws to it. We could mentally all imagine that there's nothing and then there's something that exists. We do it all the time. Right now in your mind is, let's say, a blank slate, and I tell you, imagine an apple, and the apple appears. That apple appeared out of nothing in your mental realm. Okay, well, you can imagine the whole world being like that. It's a canvas where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can make something appear. Now, based on what we know from the laws of physics, it could be a problem. But that's because you're imposing your understanding of the physical world to how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala acts or doesn't act. And that requires a lot more talk and more scientific terms that we don't have time for right now. Yeah.
Perhaps where does the law of attraction, like I'm a big believer in the law of attraction, like being able to attract good things in your life. Where would that maybe fit between the creatorship and your ability as a human being to...
If a law like that is correct, assuming that it's correct, it basically simply re-establishes, and we haven't talked about this yet, we'll come to it inshallah in the next lessons. Our idea, there's one way to view the world as a system that is completely random, and where kind of anything goes and everything is a miracle and. That's one way to view the world. The more we understand how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala operates and how He describes Himself in the Quran and in the narrations, the more we see that actually it's all laws. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put very precise, very specific laws in place for everything we could think of. From the tiniest entity to like what the Quran refers to as sunan, which some scholars have called sunan al-tariq, for instance. So there are now laws for history. Human history, you can basically predict anything that happens to an empire or a society if you apply the laws that are explained very accurately, very precisely in the Quran. You do this, this happens. You do that, that happens. Cause, effect, very simple. So there is nothing wrong with that idea itself that, let's say, if you know how to use that law, then you can attract whatever you need to attract or whatever you want to. There's nothing wrong with it in itself. Establishing that law is actually correct or valid religiously is a separate issue. But the law in itself, there's no issue with it. It doesn't contradict anything else. So long as you're saying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put a system in place, it's rigorous, it's non-contradictory, it's cohesive and coherent within itself, there are no issues with that. Was there another question here? No? Okay. I'm going to mention this one very quickly. That's why I put it between brackets. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but the author mentions it very quickly, so I just want to mention it so that if anyone's going back to the book and reading, you understand what it's saying. So we're saying how does the divine act differ from our act? How do the divine actions differ from ours? So we already explained a couple of points. A last one is we don't want to fall into the idea of the infinite regress for a divine action. So let's go back to the idea of infinite regress. What did we say? We said that if you have a number of items that need to be explained, an item that needs to be explained, and you go back to another cause to explain it, at some point you need to find an ultimate cause that causes the whole chain. If you never reach that ultimate cause, you go through infinite regress. You keep going backwards looking for a cause. And if you don't reach one, you can't explain how something is today. That's the idea of the infinite regress. But because it is there today, then something must have been there to cause it to be. So we talked about existence using the infinite regress. Existence itself falls into this category, and we explained how for the necessary being. We can do the same thing when we say, because some groups have imagined that the divine act is different than the end result. Okay, so let's say that's true for a second. Let's put the final deliverable, okay, let's put the actual end result aside. Look at the act of creation. And we ask the question, where did the act of creation come from? The act of creation itself, if you say that it's a third thing, it needs to come into existence somehow. If it's khalq, if it's another khalq that Allah creates His creation, that causes an infinite regress. Because every act of creation is going to require another act of creation. If the act is different than the end result. Because if it's the end result, then we have no issue. There is no act of creation that is different than the end result. The end result is the act, and we're done. But if you're saying that the act is different, put the end result aside and let's look at the act. Now, don't forget, the act is creation. So how does creation come to be? It was created. Okay, what about that creation? Where did it come from? It was created. And you fall into infinite regress with creation if you open the door to creation being a third entity besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the end result. As I said, I'm just mentioning this quickly. This requires more explanation, but if anyone wants a more rigorous philosophical proof, this is a proof, one of the main proofs to say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation is no different, the end result is no different than the act itself. Because the author mentions it in passing, so I'm explaining it. Lordship. This is the second attribute of action. We said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ultimate cause, the primal cause, the existential cause. He has ultimate sovereignty over everything. What does that mean? That must also mean that He basically manages the affairs of everything. That He manages the relationships of the affairs of everything. Okay? So, long story short, for ar-rububiyyah, this is what it means. In Arabic, the word Rabb, which we often associate with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, comes in different meanings. When you say tarbiyah, for instance, which is upbringing, you have the word Rabb in it. Okay? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if we say that He is a Rabb, it also implies all these other secondary or tertiary attributes. So managing of all affairs, caring for, raising, guarding, protecting, bringing into life, causing to die, guiding, commanding, and so on and so forth. Think of the father or mother in a family. What roles do you play? Think of the big boss, the CEO of a company. What role do they play? These all fall under the general term of Rabb in Arabic. You can have Rabb al-Amal, so the boss at work. Okay, you can have Rabb al-Bayt, the head of a household, and so on and so forth. So the word in Arabic goes beyond what we attribute only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, I'm insisting on this because this is our way to understand the divine attributes. You can start with what you know, but then you have to remove all the limitations, the lacks, the deficiencies that we know in the world. There are two types of lordship, two types of rububiyyah. One type of rububiyyah is basically the one that runs the world, I'm going to call it existentially. Things are the way they are because of the laws that Allah has put in place and that work on their own. Example, gravity. Example, if I feel hungry and I need food, I'm going to feel hungry, I want to eat. Okay? That's an existential law. I have nothing to do with it. Has nothing to do with whether I choose this to do something about this law or not. That's a part that I can manipulate, but the law itself is out of my control. It works. That's existential laws. It's the way the world works. But there's also what we call, so this is takwini, rububiyyah at-takwiniyah, existential lordship. There's legislative lordship. The same idea of running the world, now specifically with divine commands, but these divine commands are only directed to conscious and free beings who have been given a little window in which they may apply their free will to decide whether they want to follow those commandments or not. Everything else runs like clockwork. Even in your own body, let's say you don't believe in God and you don't want to follow any of His commandments, your body still works according to the laws of God. The existential lordship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is still applying in every aspect of your being, except for those things that He has given you free will about. For instance, He tells you, I want you to pray, or I want you to perform pilgrimage, or I want you to, so on and so forth. Here you may choose to follow or not follow. Those laws come from the same place, which is the lordship. It's the taking care of the world notion. It's managing the affairs of the world. The difference is, for everything else, I'm taking care of the world and it's happening, it's imposed on it. The world is submitted to my will as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ultimate, absolute sovereignty and absolute servitude. Okay, and that's one way to understand, for instance, when we have so many verses of the Quran that say, for instance, the moon and the sun follow a certain path, they will never move away from that path. Or when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called unto the heaven and the earth to come forth, or whether you like it or not, and they said, no, we come fully submitted. Okay, so this gives us an idea that there is a full submission in the rest of the universe for everything, including us as part of that universe, except for an area where we can apply our free will, which is our lives. We run our lives through that area. For those things, it's not a free-for-all. There are commandments just like the other ones, except that we're free to follow them or not. Of course, with repercussions. But we're free to follow them or not. Those commandments fall under the legislative lordship. So legislative lordship applies only to living beings that have free will, consciousness, knowledge, power, to if they choose to follow, if they choose not to follow. But it falls under the same attribute of lordship, rububiyyah, taking care of the world, managing the affairs of the world. Yes.
Sayid, you mentioned like when we were in the past lectures about like there's some sect in Islam, for example, they believe that Allah created us and it's like the watchmaker.
Mufawwada. Yeah.
Doesn't this, the rububiyyah, prove that this is not true because he's still sustaining us? Or we can't depend on this action?
I think yes, it does.
Okay.
But it depends how you understand it.
Also, they believe in rububiyyah, but they understand it in different
Yeah,
way. Okay.
yeah. And then you have different sects within those, and
Okay.
each has their argument.
I thought that they don't
It's a
even
good,
believe
it's a
in
good
this
link.
action.
Okay, so I think that distinction is clear between existential lordship, or rububiyyah takwiniyah, and rububiyyah tashri'iyah. Okay? So if we apply that now to everything that we know from our religion, and the importance is here so that the connections are clear with what we're going to say. We've said again and again, these topics build on each other. The way we're presenting them now is to try to show how it's a system that all fits together. So if you don't understand properly the attribute of divine lordship, specifically the legislative lordship, you don't understand where prophethood is going to come from. The idea of prophethood, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals something to some human being so that they go teach others through direct communication, through revelation, through scriptures, through laws, to the way you're going to run your individual life or your social life or your economics or your politics or. If you don't understand where it's coming from, you're going to think that these are random. It's not random, it's one system. That's why we say it all starts in what we called the metaphysical position, or what the author called the worldview. This is our worldview. If your worldview is accurate, then the rest is going to derive from it. My action depends on my understanding of the scripture. The scripture comes from the necessity of sending something because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes care of the world. If I understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attributes, I will not conceive of Him as having created a world that He just lets run in any shape or form. Just like a good boss would not let his business run in any way. He's going to put laws in place. He's going to put things in place so that the thing runs in the proper way. So we're saying there are existential components to that, which are happening despite us, in spite of what we want to do or not do. And then there is a component which is we're free to do with depending on our free will. Okay. I'm not going to spend too much time on the guidance, but guidance absolutely falls into this as well. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He guides, He also guides existentially, and He guides the little chick that knows how to break the egg to go out of the egg because he would die otherwise. That's an existential guidance. We can call it instinct, we can call it internal faculties, we can call it genetic predisposition, call it whatever you want. These are existential faculties placed into everything that exists, whether live or not live. Gravity, whatever can fall into this. That's a type of guidance. And the Quran refers to this. When Musa alayhi salam talks with Fir'aun, he tells him, رَبُّنَا الَّذِي أَعْطَى كُلَّ شَيْءٍ خَلْقَهُ ثُمَّ هَدَى. Our Lord is the one who has given everything its creation, and then He has guided it. Everything is not limited to the guidance required by human beings. Guidance is the way things are supposed to work. That's guidance. In the case of human beings, they've been given the free will to choose. And so their guidance falls under the legislative one, where they may obey or disobey. Whereas existentially, things where laws apply existentially, there is no I choose to obey or I don't obey. The law works. But I decide to break a law or not, that's a legislative law. That's not an existential law. I decide not to pray. The law is still there. I decide to break it. Which is a completely different law than gravity. No matter what I do, gravity is gravity. It's going to keep working. It's not my choosing. Finally, link between creatorship and lordship. If I really understand creatorship as the real cause, then I must also understand that the Lord of the world and the creator of the world have to be one. If I understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created every specific entity in that specific way, with all the nuances that go under that, and that He has created the relationship between that entity and every other entity, and the relationship in time, in space, in different faculties and laws, then I cannot conceive that the one who runs all of this is going to be different than the one who puts it in place. Who else is going to have the power and knowledge to give you the right way to run it? Okay, so that part hopefully is clear. The other point about the relationship between creatorship and lordship, and this is important because in the mushrikeen, the polytheists, especially in the time of the Prophet, but throughout history, are the ones who separated between these two. And they say, yes, there is a creator to the universe, and there are other divinities, other gods who run the universe. And so we worship those, and they will bring us closer to the ultimate source of the universe. Okay, so that's a quick hint. The other point here is that lordship can basically be derived from creatorship. And that's why al-khalq is a higher level attribute. Okay, based on what I just said. You would be able to derive lordship, both types, from creatorship, if you fully understand creatorship. The last attribute for today, divinity or uluhiyya. Ilah, we usually translate it as God. So what does that really mean, uluhiyya? This is a problem in English and Arabic because the word Allah does not exist in any other language. It's a proper noun. And it's a noun that groups all the attributes of Allah. So when they say God, what they're referring to is ilah. A God is an ilah. So the author says there are many definitions. He doesn't mention any. He says there are many definitions and a lot of scholarly work around this notion, this attribute. The one that we choose that we think is most befitting is the one who is worthy of worship. At first he says the one who is basically worshipable. That's why I wrote it worshipable. The one who is worshipped, or more accurately, the one who is worthy of worship. So when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of His attributes is uluhiyyah, divinity, it means He alone is worthy of worship. You derive this attribute from everything we just said. If you understand, so there's a logic between these. If you understand creatorship, if you understood the divine attributes of essence, and now here, the divine attributes of action, you understand creatorship and you understand lordship, then you cannot worship any other entity but this entity that has those attributes. So we don't jump into divinity. If you're about to talk about one of these attributes, there's a logical sequence here. You build on. You establish those attributes first, and this one derives logically out of them. Why do you worship? Well, let's go back one layer. If He has lordship over the world, He deserves worship. If He has absolute creatorship, which includes lordship, He deserves worship. That's how you extract worship out of what we've said so far. Again, it is a relational attribute. So the moment you say there's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has uluhiyya or is an ilah. Relational means there's another entity on the other side of the relationship, which means there's someone worshipping. Okay, but what if you see that there's not a lot of people worshipping the true God? It doesn't take away the fact that He is worshipable. Okay? That He is the worthy of being worshipped. Okay, so that there are a lot or not a lot of people worshipping, it's still a relationship of worship, of worthiness of worship towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's one. And then the author says that this becomes our minimal threshold of belief. So everything we've said about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the beginning until now, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists and that these are His attributes of essence. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has life, power, knowledge, and then His attributes of action, that He is the creator, that He is the Lord, and that He is worthy of worship. That becomes your minimal threshold for belief in God. So until now, we've established the minimal threshold to say, if I believe in God, what does it mean? This is what it means. What we've covered until now. And then he links it to our Islamic slogan, which is La ilaha illallah. So he says, La ilaha, that's the uluhiyya, right? So that's what we mean, worship. No one is worshipable, but that basically means it's containing everything we've said until now. No one is worshipable because there is no other Lord. No one is worshipable because there cannot be another creator. No one is worshipable because you go back to the divine attributes of essence. So I thought I would very quickly mention two narrations related to this, maybe just to push the thinking for a couple of minutes on this. The first one, coming from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, related to this. It's a longer hadith. He says, whoever says there is no God but Allah, so whoever says La ilaha illallah, with sincerity, so there's a condition, with sincerity, they will enter paradise. Easy enough. But then the Imam adds, in case someone thought that it's that easy, he says, and sincerity and ikhlas means that this statement, La ilaha illallah, that it prevents the person who says it prevents them from all that Allah has prohibited. So basically you understand what uluhiyya means. You understand that your obedience is only to Allah. That's the meaning of worship, right? It's absolute obedience. If you understand that your obedience is only to Allah, then you have sincerity when you say La ilaha illallah. Otherwise, you're not sincere when you say La ilaha illallah. You are worshipping, you are obeying someone besides Allah if you are not fully sincere in your obedience to Allah. You are not sincere in your statement. That's not a truthful statement. Okay, I think I leave with that one. The second one coming from Imam al-Rida alayhi salam, and this is a longer hadith. It's when the Imam provides a commentary. He was asked about the meaning of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maybe to make just a little bit more sense, the word ism in Arabic there's a lot of commentary on it. Just the word ism. Where does it come from? How is it declined in Arabic? There's a lot of talk about that. But very quickly, the word ism or simah are very close. And some say that they are actually from a common root, which basically means, a simah basically means a signal or a mark. Okay, so in Arabic, the word noun, name or noun, ism, basically means a mark or a label or a signal or a symbol that allows you to recognize something. That's the philosophy behind that term, ism. Okay? So the Imam is asked, Imam Rida alayhi salam is asked, so the son of the companion who asked the Imam is narrating this. He says, my father asked the Imam about the meaning of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The Imam didn't tell him the whole meaning. He only told him what Bismillah means. He says, when someone says Bismillah, Bismillah, so the word ism is in there, it means I mark myself, asimu nafsi, so I mark myself, I label myself, I target myself, I mark myself with a mark from Allah. If I say the word Bismillah, So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a simah, as an attribute, and I'm using that to tag myself with it too. So what does that mean? Basically he's saying like there's a relationship. So God is on one side, and I'm tagging myself as part of that relationship. I have to be on the other. And what's that relationship? The Imam says it's servitude. If you say Bismillah, you're tagging yourself as a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's deep. I know it's deeper. This one needs a little bit of thinking, but we say the word, and we're supposed to say it every time we do anything. We say every action which does not start with Bismillah is abtar. In Arabic they say it's cut short. Something that does not start with Bismillah is cut short. You don't get the full blessing of that action because you haven't said Bismillah, whatever the action is. So by saying that, what are we saying? What are we actually saying? So the Imam is saying, what you're saying is you recognize your absolute servitude towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with those two words, Bismillah. That's all for today. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على